My name is Russell Butler. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my career, I've worked in roles where results mattered more than recognition. Product strategy, delivery, the unglamorous middle where ideas become outcomes. I've always been the kind of person managers describe as reliable or steady, the kind they trust with high stakes work when timelines are impossible and expectations are vague. People tend to underestimate me because I don't show urgency, I don't broadcast stress, I don't narrate effort. When things get intense, I get quieter, more focused. That calm gets mistaken for contentment, or worse, compliance. This story begins the day I applied to a rival company, the day my boss took credit for $1 million project I worked on for 3 sleepless months. It wasn't impulsive, it wasn't dramatic, it was a decision that arrived with a kind of tired clarity. I had watched him present my work as his own, my frameworks, my numbers, even my phrasing, delivered smoothly to a room full of executives who nodded and smiled. As I sat there, exhausted and invisible, I realized something fundamental. Loyalty had become a one-way transaction. After watching him present my work as his own, I realized loyalty was pointless. So I turned my exhaustion into an exit plan and sent my resume to the competition. This isn't a revenge story. There's no public call out, no confrontation designed for spectacle, no last minute twist where everything magically works out. It's a documentary style account of how quiet people reclaim agency, not by getting louder, but by getting precise. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through how I became invisible without realizing it, how small dismissals normalized themselves, and how a role I never agreed to was assigned to me anyway. You'll hear about the moment something shifted internally, not anger, not betrayal, but resolve, and how silence, when chosen deliberately, becomes a form of leverage. You'll also hear about the practical side, how exhaustion can sharpen priorities, how preparation happens in plain sight, and how exits don't need explosions to be decisive. The consequences that followed weren't immediate, and they weren't theatrical, but they were real. I'm telling this honestly, without embellishment, because stories like this are common and rarely named. They live in conference rooms, slide decks, and performance reviews. They thrive when people assume professionalism means endurance, and that gratitude will eventually balance the scales. If you've ever felt your work travel upward without you, if you've ever wondered whether staying quiet was strength or self-erasure, this story might feel familiar. Before we go any further, let me ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever realized that the moment you stopped being celebrated was the moment you became most useful? To understand why that moment cut as deeply as it did, you have to understand who I was to them long before the presentation ever happened. I wasn't invisible in the obvious way. People knew my name. They relied on me. When something complex landed on the table, something with too many variables, too many dependencies, and not enough time, it usually found its way to me. Not because I was the loudest or the most confident in the room, but because I was dependable under pressure. That became my defining trait. To leadership, I was safe. To my boss, I was solid. To the team, I was the one who stayed late without being asked. I didn't posture. I didn't self-promote. When a problem appeared, I went inward instead of outward. I broke it down, mapped it, and worked through it quietly. I believed naively, in hindsight, that quality spoke for itself. In meetings, I sat where people like me always sit. Not at the center, not pushed to the margins. Close enough to be involved, far enough that no one worried about me competing for credit. When I spoke, it was usually after others had finished, filling gaps, clarifying risks, tightening loose logic. People appreciated that. What they didn't do was remember it. Over time, a pattern formed. My contributions were treated like infrastructure, essential but unremarkable. No one praises a bridge for holding weight. It's just expected to do so. And I played that role well. When deadlines slipped, I absorbed the pressure. When expectations shifted midstream, I recalibrated without complaint. When others burned out loudly, I burned quietly. That quiet mattered more than I realized. Because in environments like that, silence gets translated. It becomes an agreement. Endurance becomes consent. and reliability becomes availability, unlimited, unquestioned availability. My boss trusted me precisely because I didn't challenge him. I didn't contradict him in meetings. I didn't compete for visibility. When he asked for something unreasonable, I didn't negotiate. I delivered. At the time, I thought that was loyalty. I thought that if I carried enough weight, eventually someone would notice who was really holding things together. I believed the system rewarded substance, not noise. That patience was a strategy. What I didn't see was how patience can be repurposed by people who benefit from it. I became the person who made it work, the one who figured it out, the one who didn't need managing. And once you become that person, people stop checking how much it costs you. They also stop associating you with ownership. Ideas I developed began surfacing in conversations without my name attached. Frameworks I built were referenced as if they had always existed. When projects succeeded, the story focused on upward vision, leadership, and direction. When something was fragile or unfinished, that story drifted back toward me. I didn't resent it at first. I rationalized it. This is just how it works. I'm building trust. Visibility will come later. Those stories helped me stay functional. They also helped everyone else stay comfortable. Looking back, I can see it clearly. I wasn't being ignored. I was being positioned. Not maliciously, not consciously, but systematically. As the person close enough to the work to be accountable, and far enough from power to be expendable. And I accepted that position without ever agreeing to it. At the time, I didn't know what that would cost me. I just knew that to them, I was indispensable in the way that tools are indispensable, valuable, reliable, and rarely credited for what they make possible. The first cut didn't happen in the boardroom. It happened weeks earlier, quietly, in a way that was easy to explain away if you wanted to. I had been working on the project for months by then. 3 straight months of late nights, weekends blurred together, meals skipped or eaten in front of a screen. The scope kept expanding while the deadline stayed fixed. Every time we hit a milestone, another layer got added, another analysis, another scenario, another revision requested, just to be safe. I didn't complain. That was my mistake. One afternoon, my boss asked me to send over a draft of the core financial model. He said he wanted to review it before sharing upward. That phrasing felt normal, sensible even. I sent it over without hesitation, clean, documented, annotated. A few days later, I was looped into an email thread late, executives discussing his model. The language was subtle, but unmistakable. Questions were directed to him. Praise flowed toward him. My name wasn't mentioned once. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. It wasn't rage I felt, it was disorientation, because nothing about the email was overtly wrong. No one had lied. No one had explicitly said he'd built it himself. They had simply assumed, based on how it was presented, that it was his, and he hadn't corrected them. That was the cut. Not the omission itself, but the decision behind it. I told myself it didn't matter. That credit in the early stages was fluid. That the final presentations were what counted. I told myself that this was just part of leadership, that managers packaged their team's work. All of that was true. What I didn't want to admit was how it felt to see something I had built, line by line, travel upward without me. To watch it become someone else's voice. At the next check-in, my boss thanked me for the support. Support. Not authorship, not ownership. Support. I nodded, said nothing. That silence was small, almost polite, and it taught him something. It taught him that this boundary between contribution and credit was flexible, that I wouldn't contest it, that I would keep delivering regardless. The project accelerated after that. Expectations rose, pressure intensified, my workload increased, and with it, my proximity to risk. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself I was being professional, that I didn't need validation, that staying focused was more important than staying visible. But something subtle had changed. I began noticing how often drafts moved through him instead of directly from me, how language shifted from we to I in his updates, how my work was being reframed as execution rather than conception. No one else noticed, or maybe they did and chose not to say anything. Either way, the cut healed over on the surface. Work continued. Deadlines loomed. But beneath that smoothness, something had been severed. Not trust, illusion. And once the illusion breaks, even slightly, you start seeing the pattern that made it possible. Once something happens more than once, your mind starts working to make it livable. That's how normalization begins. Not with acceptance, but with explanation. After that first cut, I became more alert, but not more assertive. I noticed things, filed them away, and kept moving. The project was too big, too visible, too close to completion for me to risk becoming difficult. At least, that's what I told myself. The second time was harder to ignore. We were in a progress meeting with senior leadership. My boss walked them through the roadmap. Phases, risks, contingencies. It was my roadmap. I recognized the structure instantly, the sequencing, even the phrasing. When a question came up about an edge case, he answered confidently using an example I had written into the notes at 2 a.m, weeks earlier. Again, no one looked at me. Again, I said nothing. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger, not humiliation, but a growing sense of displacement, like I was watching myself from the outside, slowly edited out of my own work. After the meeting, a colleague messaged me privately. Great thinking on that risk scenario. It was meant kindly, it landed badly, because even then the credit came sideways. Quiet, unofficial, something that existed only between us, never in the room where it mattered. That's when I started rationalizing in earnest. He's just the messenger. This is how leadership works. My time will come. Those thoughts were soothing. They allowed me to keep functioning without friction, but they also asked me to swallow something each time, something small but cumulative. As weeks went on, the pattern repeated. Drafts I sent up returned with minimal changes and different ownership language. Talking points I prepared appeared in decks with his name in the corner. When executives praised his strategic vision, he accepted it easily, naturally. I watched how effortlessly he grew into that version of the story, and I watched how easily I was excluded from it. The most unsettling part was how normal it began to feel. I stopped feeling surprised. I stopped expecting acknowledgement. I began preemptively detaching my sense of worth from outcomes I could no longer claim. That detachment looked like maturity from the outside. From the inside, it felt like erosion. I also noticed how my workload shifted. I was no longer just building. I was polishing, stress testing, backstopping. The work I was given increasingly lived in the shadows. Contingency plans, downside scenarios, things no one wanted to talk about unless something went wrong. And if something did go wrong, everyone knew where to look. I stayed late. I fixed problems before they surfaced. I protected the project, and by extension, my boss, from exposure. That too became normal. No one asked if I was okay. No one checked whether the balance felt fair. Why would they? I hadn't indicated otherwise. Silence had done its job. By the time I realized I was no longer being overlooked but relied upon invisibly, the dynamic had already calcified. This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It was a role, and I was playing it well. What I didn't yet realize was that every time I normalized the disrespect, I made the next step easier for them and harder for me. Because once people get used to taking without resistance, they don't stop on their own. They just take more. There's a point where patterns stop feeling accidental and start feeling instructional. For me, that point came not through confrontation, but through observation. Watching how people spoke around me rather than to me. Watching how decisions were framed in rooms I was invited into, and how outcomes were summarized in rooms I wasn't. I began to see the role I'd been assigned, even though no one had ever named it. I was the builder, the stabilizer, the one who made ambitious promises as survivable. Not the face, not the voice, the force underneath. In meetings, my presence served a specific function. When something sounded risky, people glanced in my direction, not to ask my opinion, but to see whether I reacted. My lack of reaction became reassurance. If Russell wasn't objecting, it must be fine. That was the role. I wasn't there to shape direction. I was there to absorb doubt. When executives asked difficult questions, my boss answered them with confidence because he knew I would handle whatever complexity followed. When timelines tightened, he didn't push back upward. He pushed downward, confident I would find a way to make it work. And I did. Every time I realized something unsettling, my reliability had become a resource others spent freely. The more competent I proved myself, the more responsibility drifted toward me, without authority following it. Ownership stayed with him. Risk is pooled with me. Credit flowed upward. That imbalance didn't feel dramatic day to day. It felt logical, almost inevitable. That's how roles entrench themselves. I noticed how often I was described as supporting a project I had architected, how my contributions were framed as execution rather than conception, how decisions were attributed to leadership vision, while complications were attributed to operational reality. Operational reality lived with me. No one questioned it because I didn't. I had become useful in a very specific way. I made other people look decisive. I made their confidence feel earned. I made their certainty safe. And in return, I was granted proximity, but not authorship. The clearest signal came when my boss began speaking for me preemptively, answering questions that should have come to me, summarizing my thinking without checking whether it still matches, treating my work as an extension of his intent rather than as an independent contribution. He wasn't trying to silence me. He had simply stopped seeing me as Vrayet. That's the danger of being too reliable. You stop being perceived as a person with agency and start being perceived as a function. I saw then that the role wasn't temporary. It wasn't a phase on the way to recognition. It was the destination. And roles like that don't come with exits built in. They come with expectations. Expectation that I would stay late. Expectation that I would smooth over the friction. Expectation that I would protect the project no matter what it cost me. What unsettled me most wasn't the unfairness. It was the realization that I had helped construct this dynamic through silence, through endurance, through a belief that good work inevitably finds its own credit. That belief had made me predictable, and predictability in power structures is something others learn to use. By the time I fully understood the role I was playing, reliable, useful, invisible, it was already being treated as permanent. The question was no longer whether I liked the role. The question was whether I would continue performing it without ever having agreed to it. The shift didn't happen in the meeting. It didn't happen when my boss rehearsed his talking points, or when executives nodded along, or even when my name failed to appear on the final deck. All of that was painful, but familiar by then. The shift happened afterward, quietly, almost mundanely, when I was alone. The presentation had gone well. Too well. Applause. Handshakes, compliments directed at him. The $1 million figure hung in the air like proof of competence, of leadership, of vision. My work. I stayed behind after everyone left, sitting in the same conference room, staring at the screen as the last slide faded to black. For the first time in months, there was nothing left to deliver. No deadline, no revision, no next step. Just silence and exhaustion. Not the physical kind. You can sleep that off. This was deeper. A bone-level fatigue that comes from sustained effort without ownership. From carrying weight that never becomes yours, no matter how long you hold it. I opened my laptop out of habit, then closed it again. And in that stillness, a thought surfaced that surprised me with how calm it was. I'm done being loyal to something that isn't loyal to me. There was no anger attached to it, no bitterness, just recognition. I replayed the presentation in my head, not to torture myself, but to observe it clearly. How easily my boss had spoken in my voice. How naturally the room had accepted the narrative. How unnecessary I had been to the story once the work was complete. That's when something finally clicked. Loyalty, as I had practiced it, wasn't mutual. It was aspirational. I was loyal to an idea of fairness that no one else in that room was actively protecting. And once I saw that, the emotional contract dissolved. I didn't confront him. I didn't send a pointed message. I didn't even tell anyone how I felt. Those responses belonged to an older version of me, one that still believed recognition could be negotiated. Instead, I asked myself a different question. If I stopped expecting this place to change, what would I do next? The answer came quickly. I would leave. Not dramatically, not impulsively, not as punishment, as alignment. I realized then that staying wasn't a strength anymore. It was inertia, habit, fear disguised as professionalism. That afternoon, I went home earlier than usual. I didn't open my work laptop. I didn't check messages. I sat at my kitchen table, opened my personal computer, and pulled up my resume. I didn't rewrite it yet. I didn't send anything. I just looked at it. And for the first time in months, the exhaustion felt purposeful. It had finally told me the truth instead of asking me to endure it. That was the day something shifted. Not externally, internally. Because once loyalty breaks quietly, it doesn't ask for permission on its way out. After that day, my silence changed its meaning. Before, it had been reflexive, a habit formed from wanting to be agreeable, professional, and low friction. I stayed quiet because speaking up felt unnecessary, or worse, risky. Silence had been my way of surviving the pace. Now, it was deliberate. I didn't announce anything. I didn't signal dissatisfaction. I didn't even alter my tone. On the surface, I remained exactly who they expected me to be, dependable, focused, uncomplaining. That consistency was intentional, because the moment you change your demeanor, people start watching you differently. They ask questions, they adjust, they protect themselves. I wanted none of that. So I stayed calm, still helpful, still responsive. But internally, I stopped volunteering pieces of myself that had once been freely given. I no longer filled gaps that weren't assigned to me. I stopped anticipating needs before they were articulated. When ambiguity surfaced, I let it exist long enough to be acknowledged instead of rushing to resolve it quietly. That wasn't rebellion, it was a restraint. Others mistook it for fatigue, or compliance, or acceptance. A few probably assumed I had finally learned my place. That misinterpretation gave me room. In meetings, I spoke only when asked, and only to the scope of the question. No extrapolation, no extra insight offered to make someone else look sharper. When my boss summarized the work I had done, I didn't correct him. I also didn't expand on his version. Silence, used this way, is revealing. People talk more when they think no one is challenging them. They explain themselves. They expose assumptions. They grow comfortable. I listened, not with suspicion, with clarity. I noticed how often my boss framed outcomes as leadership decisions while quietly framing risks as operational realities. I noticed how my name surfaced in conversations about execution, never strategy. How responsibility drifted downward while ownership stayed put. And I let it happen, because every assumption people make about you becomes part of the record, formal or not. And records accumulate weight over time. I also began doing something else quietly. I prepared, not in a dramatic way. No secret meetings, no covert plans, just practical alignment. I updated my resume slowly, carefully, making sure it reflected outcomes without naming people. I reconnected with former colleagues, not to complain, but to re-establish context. Conversations that once would have felt disloyal now felt honest. I didn't rush to apply anywhere. Silence gave me patience. It let the emotional static settle so decisions could be clean. At work, my boss grew more confident, not less. He assumed the project's success had reinforced the hierarchy, that I'd seen how things worked and accepted it. In a way, he was right. I had accepted something, just not what he thought. Silence had stopped being submission. It had become space, and in that space I could finally hear myself clearly. Without the noise of obligation, without the need to be seen as loyal by people who had never extended that loyalty back. They believed my quiet meant I was staying. They didn't realize it meant I was already gone, just not visibly yet. Preparation doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look like defiance or withdrawal. It looks consistent, like someone doing exactly what they've always done, just with a different internal objective. That's why they never noticed what was happening in front of them. From the outside, my behavior was unchanged. Same hours, same responsiveness, same calm demeanor. If anything, I seemed easier to manage, less opinionated, more focused. Internally, everything had reorganized. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't even planning an escape yet. I was learning how to separate my value from my visibility and how to make sure the former could travel without the latter being exploited. The first thing I did was map my own work, honestly. Not the inflated version you put on a resume, the real one. What I owned end to end, where my decisions had materially changed outcomes, which results existed because I had pushed, questioned, or stayed awake when others logged off. That exercise was grounding because it reminded me that my contribution wasn't hypothetical, it was measurable. And measurable things can be transferred. I also began paying attention to how my boss operated when he didn't think he was being observed closely. What he emphasized, what he glossed over, how he spoke about his accomplishments versus team execution. Not to judge him, but to understand the environment I was actually in, not the one I'd hoped for. At the same time, I started quietly reacquainting myself with the market, reading job descriptions, not applying yet, just calibrating, seeing how my skills translated outside the narrow box I'd been placed in. What surprised me was how well they traveled. The things that had made me invisible internally, my ability to carry complexity, to integrate across functions, to deliver without drama, were exactly what other companies described as leadership traits. That realization didn't inflate my ego. It clarified my options. I updated my resume slowly, thoughtfully, one line at a time. Every bullet is anchored to outcome, not effort. Revenue impact, risk mitigation, delivery under constraint. No mention of sleepless nights, just results. I also began documenting, not for conflict, but for continuity. I wanted to make sure that when I eventually moved on, there would be no confusion about what I had owned and what I hadn't. Clean transitions protect everyone, including you. At work, no one noticed any of this. Why would they? I wasn't pulling away. I wasn't disengaging. I was still solving problems, just no longer volunteering to solve problems that belonged to someone else. That subtle boundary shift went unnoticed because it didn't disrupt anything immediately. It only removed excess. And excess, once gone, is rarely missed until pressure returns. What they never noticed was that my loyalty had already been reallocated, not away from the company, toward myself, toward accuracy, toward sustainability, toward work that didn't require me to disappear in order to succeed. By the time anyone sensed that something was different, the foundation had already shifted. I wasn't reacting to events anymore. I was positioning for a future that didn't require permission from people who had mistaken my silence for surrender. And that made all the difference. The realization didn't arrive with excitement. There was no surge of confidence, no cinematic moment where everything suddenly made sense and felt empowering. It arrived quietly, almost clinically, the way truths do when you finally stop resisting them. I was sitting alone one evening, reviewing my resume draft alongside the project documentation I still had open, out of habit, metrics on one screen, market roles on the other hand. And for the first time, I wasn't looking at them as separate worlds. I was comparing them. That's when the private reveal happened. The $1 million project, the one that had cost me 3 sleepless months, mapped almost perfectly onto roles at competing firms. Strategy, execution, cross-functional leadership, financial ownership. The work that had been minimized internally was being explicitly sought elsewhere. Not support, not execution, ownership. I realized then that the problem had never been my contribution. It had been context. Inside my company, my value was being compressed to preserve hierarchy. Outside of it, the same value expanded naturally, not because competitors were kinder or wiser, but because they had no incentive to erase me. That was the first layer of clarity. The second came when I replayed the presentation in my head again. Not emotionally this time, but structurally. I saw how easily my boss had stepped into authorship, how naturally the room had accepted it, how little resistance there had been because no one believed I would object. That wasn't arrogance on his part. It was pattern recognition. I had trained him to believe I wouldn't leave, and that quietly was my leverage. Not in the sense of threat, but in optionality. I didn't need to expose him. I didn't need to confront anyone. I didn't need validation from the room that had already moved on. I needed one thing only, an exit that respected my work. The clarity deepened when I acknowledged something uncomfortable. If I stayed, nothing would fundamentally change. Even if credit came later, it would arrive filtered, granted, not owned. And ownership is the line I could no longer cross back over. This wasn't bitterness, it was alignment. I didn't hate my boss, I didn't resent the company. I simply stopped confusing endurance with virtue. The exhaustion I felt wasn't a badge of honor, it was a signal. So the private reveal wasn't about discovering wrongdoing or secret leverage. It was discovering permission. Permission to stop waiting. Permission to stop hoping the system would notice. Permission to choose a future that didn't require erasure as a prerequisite. I closed the project files, not dramatically, just deliberately. Then I opened my resume again, and this time I knew exactly what it was for. People assume the decision to leave happens in a burst of emotion. It doesn't. It happens when the emotional noise finally dies down enough for logic to speak clearly. By the time I reached that point, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger would have pushed me toward confrontation, toward trying to fix something that had already shown me exactly what it was. What I felt instead was a steady, almost detached focus, like a lens snapping into clarity. I laid out my options the same way I lay out any complex problem. The first option was to stay, not dramatically, not definitely, just stay, do good work, and hope that the visibility I'd earned would eventually convert into recognition. Maybe next project, maybe next quarter, maybe after the next reorg. That option required one thing from me: patience without guarantees. And I finally admitted to myself that patience had already cost me too much. Staying would mean accepting that my best work might always belong to someone else's narrative, that my role would remain execution heavy and ownership light. That loyalty in this environment was something given downward and harvested upward. I knew I could survive that. I just didn't want to. The second option was confrontation. I could sit my boss down, explain what I'd seen, ask for acknowledgement, demand clearer boundaries around credit and ownership. It would be calm, professional, reasonable, and it would change nothing essential, because confrontation assumes shared values. It assumes the other person sees the situation the way you do and simply needs it pointed out. But what I'd witnessed wasn't ignorance. It was comfort. He was comfortable with the arrangement because it benefited him. At best, confrontation would lead to cosmetic correction. A mention here, a thank you there, nothing structural, nothing durable, and worse, it would mark me. From that point on, I wouldn't be invisible anymore. I'd be managed, watched, interpreted through the lens of risk rather than reliability. That wasn't power, that was containment. The third option was to leave quietly, not as a threat, not as a statement, just as a fact. To redirect my energy toward an environment that didn't require me to negotiate for authorship. To take the skills I had sharpened under pressure and apply them somewhere they were explicitly valued. This option didn't give me vindication, it gave me control. And control, I realized, mattered more than credit. The moment of decision came late one night. No music, no ceremony, just me, my laptop, and a resume that finally felt honest. I opened a job listing from a rival company. Same industry, similar scale, different culture, at least on paper. The role description read like a summary of the work I'd just completed, minus the invisibility. I didn't hesitate. I customized the resume carefully, not emotionally, factually. Outcomes, impact, scope. I didn't mention my boss. I didn't explain why I was looking. I just presented myself as I actually was. Then I attached it. Hovering over the send button, I didn't feel fear. I felt relief. Because this wasn't an escape. It was a correction. I clicked send. And with that, the decision became irreversible. Not because I'd burned a bridge, but because I'd finally stopped waiting for permission to cross it. Once I sent the resume, the most important thing I did was nothing. No visible change, no emotional shift, no symbolic gesture that might hint at what was already in motion. That restraint wasn't accidental, it was strategic. People imagine that once you decide to leave, you mentally check out. You detach. You start counting days. That's how exits get detected early and how leverage quietly disappears. I did the opposite. I stayed fully present. Not because I owed anyone loyalty anymore, but because discipline is part of self-respect. I wasn't going to let the final chapter of my time there be sloppy or reactive. I wanted it clean, controlled, unmistakably professional. At work, I narrowed my focus with surgical precision. I delivered exactly what was asked of me. No anticipatory fixes, no unrequested heroics, no filling in gaps that existed only because someone else hadn't done their job yet. That was a shift, but a subtle one. Before, I had treated ambiguity as my responsibility. Now I treated it as a question to be clarified. If instructions were vague, I asked for specificity. If ownership was unclear, I asked for confirmation. Not confrontationally, casually. I just want to make sure I'm aligned. Can you confirm who owns this piece? Is this in scope for my role, or should it live elsewhere? Language like that doesn't raise alarms. It sounds conscientious. It sounds like maturity, but it does something important. It moves responsibility back to where it belongs. I also became meticulous about documentation. Not out of fear, out of closure. Decisions were summarized, priorities confirmed, deliverables are defined clearly. If something was discussed verbally, I followed up in writing. Not to protect myself from accusation, to protect myself from erasure. Outside the office, my silence took on a different form. I didn't tell colleagues I was exploring options. I didn't vent. I didn't fish for reassurance. I didn't ask for validation. Those conversations create emotional gravity. And emotional gravity can pull you back into patterns you've already decided to leave. Instead, I prepared quietly. I refined my resume slowly, deliberately, over multiple evenings. Each line was anchored to outcome, not effort. Revenue influenced, risk reduced, systems built. I stripped away language that minimized my role and replaced it with language that reflected ownership. That process alone was revealing. I could see how much I had compressed myself over the years. How often I'd used supported where led was accurate. How frequently I'd softened language to avoid seeming arrogant. I stopped doing that, not to exaggerate, but to be precise. I also researched companies carefully, not just brand names, but leadership styles, reporting structures, and turnover patterns. I wasn't looking for perfection, I was looking for alignment. When recruiters reached out, I responded calmly. I didn't rush, I didn't oversell. I treated each conversation as data, not destiny. That mindset changed everything, because when you're not trying to escape, you ask better questions. You listen more closely. You notice red flags instead of rationalizing them. Interviews began quietly. Lunch hour calls, early mornings, evenings that once would have been spent catching up on work. I didn't tell my boss. I didn't need to. And here's the part no one noticed at all. My fear was gone. Deadlines no longer tightened my chest. Praise no longer anchored me emotionally. Pressure no longer blurred my judgment. When your future isn't dependent on the approval of the room you're in, the room loses its ability to distort you. At work, my boss grew more relaxed. The project's success had confirmed his version of reality. He assumed stability, continuity, that the system had held and would continue to hold. In a narrow sense, he was right. I was stable, I was professional, I was consistent. What he didn't realize was that stability no longer meant permanence. I hadn't disengaged, I had decoupled. My identity was no longer tethered to that role. My sense of worth no longer rose or fell with how my work was presented. And because nothing about my behavior signaled departure, no one adjusted around me. No one prepared, no one protected themselves. I became invisible again. But this time, invisibility wasn't a weakness. It was covered. The consequences didn't announce themselves. They never do. They arrived disguised as minor inconveniences, small delays, subtle hesitations, a faint but growing sense that things no longer moved as smoothly as they once had. At first, it was barely noticeable. A meeting got postponed because someone needed a bit more clarity. An email chain stalled while people waited for confirmation that used to be implied. A decision that normally would have been made in minutes sat unresolved for days. No one panicked, no one complained. But I noticed, because for a long time I had been the thing that kept those moments from happening. I was the connective tissue, the translator, the person who quietly bridged gaps between intention and execution. Now, I wasn't doing that anymore. Not aggressively, not visibly. I was simply no longer compensating. My boss began feeling it first, though I doubt he realized what he was feeling. He asked more follow-up questions than usual, double-checked the details he used to gloss over, requested updates with a slightly sharper edge, as if speed alone could restore momentum. It couldn't, because momentum had never been automatic. It had been managed. Other teams began pushing back. Not loudly, just procedurally. Can you clarify ownership? We'll need confirmation before moving forward. Let's document this before proceeding. Language I had used quietly for years was now being used on him, and it slowed everything down. The $1 million project was done, but its aftershocks weren't. New initiatives built on its success needed the same invisible scaffolding, and suddenly that scaffolding wasn't there. I could feel the system searching for it. People reached out to me more often, but differently. Not with assumptions, you'll handle this, but with questions, tentative ones. Do you have time to take a look? Can you advise? Just wanted your thoughts. I responded politely, professionally, and narrowly. I gave input when it was requested. I didn't chase problems that hadn't been assigned to me. I didn't step in to rescue timelines that weren't mine to own. Nothing I did could be labeled as disengagement, but the effect was undeniable. Decisions hesitated, confidence wavered, small risks stayed unresolved longer than they should have. And in corporate environments, unresolved risk breeds anxiety faster than failure ever does. I saw it in meetings. People spoke more carefully. They hedged. They over-explained. The casual certainty that had characterized earlier discussions was gone, replaced by a subtle defensiveness. No one said, "Something's wrong." They didn't have to. The system felt heavier. My boss tried to compensate by asserting more control, more check-ins, more oversight, more urgency. But urgency without clarity only magnifies friction. And friction reveals the dependencies. That's when I realized something important. My absence wasn't being felt as a loss yet. It was being felt as uncertainty. They didn't miss me. They missed what I had quietly been doing for them. And because they never fully understood that role, they couldn't easily replace it. I watched all of this calmly without satisfaction or resentment. This wasn't punishment. It was cause and effect. When someone stops carrying weight that was never meant to be theirs, the system has to reckon with the imbalance. Sometimes it adapts. Sometimes it strains. At this stage, they were still hoping things would settle back into place, that whatever had changed would correct itself without requiring introspection. They believed this was temporary. They believed control could be reasserted. They were wrong, because what had changed wasn't effort or attitude. It was availability. And once availability disappears, the consequences don't reverse. They accumulate. The moment they realized this wasn't temporary, everything sped up. And somehow that made it worse. Urgency replaced confidence. Not the productive kind, but the restless, reactive kind that shows up when people sense control slipping through their fingers. Meetings multiplied, calendars filled. Conversations that used to happen casually now require agendas and follow-ups. They were trying to recreate momentum. What they didn't understand was that momentum isn't something you can demand once trust and clarity have eroded. It's something that accumulates quietly over time and disappears the moment the person sustaining it steps back. My boss started reaching out more frequently, often under the guise of alignment. I just want to make sure we're on the same page. Quick sync to keep things moving. Can you walk me through how you'd approach this? None of these requests was unreasonable on its own, but together they revealed something important. He was no longer certain. He was trying to rebuild the map after realizing he hadn't been holding it. I answered every question calmly, methodically. I explained processes without absorbing ownership. I outlined options without choosing for him. I described risks without neutralizing them. That distinction mattered. Before, I would have closed the loop myself, made the decision feel lighter, safer, inevitable. Now I left space where space belonged. That space unsettled people. I could see it in how often conversations doubled back on themselves, how frequently were deferred until next week, how often someone asked, "Are we comfortable with this?" instead of, "Let's do it." Comfort had left the room. That's when regret began surfacing. Not openly, but in tone, in the sudden warmth of compliments that arrived too late, in acknowledgements that felt oddly specific, as if someone was trying to retroactively correct a record no one had formally challenged. Well, of course, Russell was critical to that. We couldn't have done it without his work. Statements like that floated through meetings without landing anywhere, because recognition without ownership doesn't change structure. And the structure was the problem. Behind closed doors, I'm sure they discussed options. adjustments, ways to stabilize things, perhaps even ways to re-anchor me emotionally, to make me feel seen enough to resume my old role. But emotional appeals only work when the person you're appealing to still believes in the exchange. I didn't. The final attempts came in subtler forms, a hint at future opportunities, a suggestion of more visibility next time, vague promises that required patience. Again, I listened politely and let them pass, because by then the window for fixing things had closed, not because I was unwilling to talk, but because the underlying assumptions had already been exposed. They hadn't just taken credit, they had built a system that depended on my silence and endurance, and then acted surprised when that silence stopped carrying weight. By the time they sensed the full extent of the shift, there was nothing left to negotiate. Not because I was angry, but because I was finished waiting. And once waiting ends, no amount of urgency can rewind the clock. The confrontation didn't arrive as an argument. It arrived as an invitation. A meeting request dropped onto my calendar late in the afternoon. Short notice, carefully worded. Quick sync. Nothing alarming, nothing explicit. But by then, I'd learned to read tone instead of text. This wasn't about alignment. This was about containment. The room was small. Glass walls, neutral lighting. My boss sat across from me, posture relaxed but eyes alert. Someone from leadership joined a few minutes later, smiling too deliberately. No legal, no HR. That too was intentional. They wanted this to feel informal. They began the way people do when they're unsure where the fault line is, by circling the issue instead of naming it. References to how things have felt lately, to momentum shifts, to the need for clarity moving forward. I listened, then came the question, framed gently enough to sound supportive. Is everything okay on your end? That was the opening, not an accusation, not yet. An invitation for me to fill in gaps, to reassure, to normalize what they were feeling without forcing them to confront why they were feeling it. I didn't take it. I answered calmly, factually. I'm fine. I'm focused on what's within my scope. There was a pause, the kind that signals recalibration. They tried again, this time more specific. A comment about the project, about how much responsibility I had carried, about how the team really valued my contribution. Valued. Past tense. I acknowledged it with a nod, nothing more. That's when the conversation shifted. They began talking about future opportunities, about growth, about visibility. Carefully vague promises designed to restore equilibrium without changing structure. I let them finish. Then I said evenly, I've been reflecting on how work is owned and presented here, and I've realized I need alignment on that to continue growing. No accusation, no emotion, just a statement. The room went quiet. My boss responded first, surprised but controlled. He spoke about leadership responsibility, about how managers often present teamwork, about how none of it was personal. I didn't contradict him. I said, I understand how it works. I just need to be clear on how I work. That was the moment the heat left the room entirely, because confrontation without anger forces honesty. There was no tone to push against, no emotion to manage, only substance. They asked what I meant. I told them, succinctly, that ownership mattered to me, that visibility wasn't about ego, but about accountability, that I wasn't interested in continuing a pattern where execution absorbed risk while authorship traveled upward. I didn't demand anything. I stated boundaries, and boundaries don't argue back. There was no resolution in that meeting, no apology, no sudden realization, just a mutual understanding settling into place. They knew I wasn't bluffing. I knew they couldn't offer what I was asking for, not without changing more than they were willing to change. We ended politely, with thanks, with a sense of finality no one said out loud. I walked out calm, not victorious, not wounded, just clear, because the confrontation wasn't about winning. It was about removing ambiguity. And once ambiguity is gone, the next steps don't require emotion. They require action. What changed after that conversation wasn't immediate, and it wasn't dramatic. There was no announcement, no reshuffling of titles, no sudden shift in how people treated me day to day. Systems like that rarely transform overnight. They absorb tension, redistribute it, and keep moving. What changed was internal. For the first time in a long while, my actions and my values were no longer in conflict. I wasn't performing patience while quietly resenting it. I wasn't confusing professionalism with self-erasure. I had named my boundary, to them, yes, but more importantly, to myself. That clarity simplified everything. I stopped overthinking interactions. I no longer scanned conversations for hidden meaning or delayed recognition. I did my work cleanly, thoroughly, and within scope. When asked for input, I gave it. When something wasn't mine to carry, I let it rest where it belonged. And I slept better. That might sound small, but it isn't. Sleep returns when your nervous system stops bracing for unfairness, when you're no longer rehearsing conversations in your head or wondering how your work will be reframed once it leaves your hands. I noticed something else too. My confidence changed texture. It wasn't louder, it wasn't performative, it was quieter and heavier, less dependent on how others responded. I didn't need to be seen to feel real. I didn't need acknowledgement to know what I had built. That shift affected how I showed up everywhere. In interviews, I spoke plainly. No defensiveness, no over-explaining. I didn't pitch myself as loyal or tireless. I described outcomes, ownership, and judgment. I talked about limits as a strength. People responded to that. Not everyone, but the right ones. I also let go of the need to be understood by the people I was leaving behind. That was harder than I expected. There's a part of you that wants recognition retroactively. To have someone say, "We should have done better by you." I stopped waiting for that, because waiting keeps you tethered. Instead, I focused on continuity, on making sure my transition, when it came, would be clean. No scorched earth, no whispered warnings, just accuracy, respect, completion. That too was part of who I am now. I don't burn bridges to feel powerful. I don't need to prove I was right. I don't need an audience for my departure. Power, I've learned, is being able to leave without dragging the past with you. If there's one word that defines me now, it's selective. Selective about where I invest effort. Selective about who gets my extra attention. Selective about which systems I'm willing to carry on my back. I still work hard. I still care. But I no longer confuse care with sacrifice that goes unnamed and unreciprocated. And there's no bitterness in that, just discernment. I didn't lose my loyalty. I redirected it to work that acknowledges ownership, to environments that don't require invisibility as the price of admission, and to myself. That's who I am now. Not louder, not colder, just no longer willing to disappear. There's a version of this story that could have ended with vindication, with public recognition, with someone being corrected in a room full of people, with a neat moral bow, where effort is finally rewarded the way it's supposed to be. That version is comforting. It's also rare. Most stories like mine don't resolve through dramatic justice. They resolve through realignment, through a quiet decision to stop participating in a dynamic that only works if one person keeps giving more than they're allowed to own. What I learned is this: loyalty, when it isn't reciprocal, doesn't make you noble. It makes you useful in ways that are easy to exploit and hard to undo. For a long time, I believed that if I worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, proved myself consistently enough, the system would eventually correct itself. That credit would find its way back downstream. That fairness was just delayed, not denied. But systems don't correct themselves out of gratitude. They correct themselves when incentives change. And sometimes the only incentive that matters is absence. I didn't leave in anger. I didn't expose anyone. I didn't try to reclaim the past or rewrite the story they told about that project. I let them keep it. What I took with me was more valuable. I took clarity. I took ownership of my time. I took the right to decide where my effort belonged. That's the part people misunderstand about quiet exits. They assume they're passive, weak, avoidant. They're not. They're precise. They're the decision to stop explaining your worth to people who benefit from not understanding it, to stop waiting for acknowledgement from structures that were built to distribute credit upward by default. And maybe most importantly, they're the decision to listen when exhaustion stops being a temporary state and starts being information. Exhaustion is often framed as something to push through, a badge of commitment, a phase you endure on the way to something better. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it's your clarity arriving early. Looking back, I don't regret the work. I don't even regret the sleepless months. What I regret is how long I believed endurance was the same thing as loyalty, and how long I postponed asking myself who that loyalty was really serving. If you're in a place right now where your work travels without you, where your effort becomes someone else's narrative, where staying quiet feels less like professionalism and more like disappearance, pause, not to react, not to confront, just to listen, because you don't need to make noise to reclaim yourself. You don't need permission to choose alignment, and you don't need to wait for someone else to notice your value before you act on it. I'll leave you with one question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your answer in the comments. Have you ever reached a point where staying felt loyal, but leaving felt honest?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.